conditioning did not just cool a few rooms, it quietly redrew the map of the United States. It decided which cities would swell into the millions and which ones would be left behind, and it even helped shift the balance of power inside Washington itself. And here is the strange part. None of that was ever the plan. The whole story begins with a stack of soggy paper in a Brooklyn factory, and a young engineer who was not trying to make a single human being more comfortable. He was trying to save the ink on a magazine. So how does a machine built to rescue a few damp pages end up moving tens of millions of Americans across an entire continent? Stay close, because the answer runs straight through a summer so brutal it once helped kill sitting senators, through movie theaters that quietly rewrote how the country tells its stories, and out into a stretch of desert that had no business ever becoming a metropolis. This is the hidden history of the thing humming quietly in your window right now, and by the end, you will never think of it as just a way to stay cool again. To understand what this one invention changed, you first have to understand what the country was like without it. And the truth is, for most of American history, summer was not an inconvenience. It was a threat. Picture Washington in July, back in the 1800s. The city had been built on low, marshy ground near a river, a place of wetlands and thick, swampy air. When the heat rolled in, the humidity settled over the streets like a wet blanket that never lifted. There was no escaping it indoors either, because indoors was often worse. Brick and stone held the heat of the day and released it slowly through the night, so a bedroom at midnight could feel like an oven that had been left on since noon. Now imagine trying to run a country in that. For generations, the men who governed the United States simply refused to. Congress would gather in December, work through the cooler months, and then flee the capital before the worst of the summer arrived. This was not laziness, it was survival. The heat of Washington was considered so punishing that American diplomats posted to the city were once given hardship pay for enduring it. The same kind of bonus you might expect for a dangerous posting overseas. The members of Congress, strangely, got no such bonus. So they voted with their feet, and they left. But the ones who stayed learned exactly how dangerous that swamp air could be. The Senate chamber, sealed and poorly ventilated, developed a grim nickname. People began to call it a death trap, and they were not being dramatic. Between 1916 and 1924, 22 sitting senators died in office. When a physician named Royal Copeland arrived in the Senate in 1923, a man who had once run the New York City Board of Health, he took one breath of that chamber and blamed the air itself. He was convinced the room was making the lawmakers sick, and the numbers gave him a chilling case. A later analysis found that in the years before cooling arrived, members of Congress were dying at a noticeably higher rate than ordinary Americans of the same age. So this is where you land before our machine exists. The most powerful assembly in the country could not safely stay in its own capital through August. One veteran of that era, John Nance Garner, summed up the whole miserable season in a single line that became famous on Capitol Hill. "No good legislation," he said, "ever comes out of Washington after June." And here is what makes that so haunting. Washington was not special. It was just the version of the story that got written down, because the people suffering happened to run the government. Out in the rest of the country, the same heat was killing ordinary people every summer, and the newspapers reported it the way they reported the weather. Heat deaths were a routine, almost casual fact of daily life, a grim little column you skimmed past on your way to the sports pages. Life bent itself around this heat in ways that are easy to forget now. Chocolate makers pushed their workshops down into cool basements so their product would not melt into sludge. Bakeries in Chicago went underground for the same reason, into dark, damp rooms that people worried were breeding grounds for disease. In the South, a hotel that could offer you a cool room charged extra for the privilege, sometimes a whole $1 a night, just to sleep, without sweating through the sheets. Comfort, in other words, was a luxury good, and most people simply could not buy it. Before we go any further into how all of this got turned upside down, take a second and drop a note in the comments telling us where in the world you are watching from and what the weather is doing outside your window right now. Every single one gets read, and it is always fascinating to see who is out there. Now, keep that image of the sweltering, unlivable summer in your mind, because the thing that ended it did not come from anyone trying to end it at all. It came from a printing problem. Go back to the summer of 1902, to a lithography and publishing company in Brooklyn called Sackett and Wilhelms. This was a business that printed in color, and color printing in that era was a delicate, temperamental art. Each color had to be laid down in a separate pass, and every pass had to line up perfectly with the last. But in the humid New York summer, the paper itself would not cooperate. It swelled and shifted as it soaked up moisture from the air, so the reds landed a hair off from the blues, and a crisp printed page turned into a smeared, blurry mess. The ink ran. The whole job was ruined. The company needed someone to fix the air, and the problem landed on the desk of a young research engineer named Willis Carrier. He was only 25, barely a year out of Cornell, working for a firm that mostly made forges and fans and heaters. He was not a visionary, chasing a dream of human comfort. He was an employee handed a headache, but he approached it the way the best engineers do, with relentless testing and careful measurement, and he worked out something clever. If he passed the air over coils filled with cold water, the moisture in that air would condense out and drip away, leaving the air drier and, as a side effect, cooler. That was it. That was the birth of modern air conditioning, and it happened not to soothe a sweating human being, but to keep a magazine page from wrinkling. The drawings were dated the 17th of July, 1902, and Carrier himself did not fully grasp what he had unleashed. He was solving for humidity. The cool air was almost an accident, a leftover, a byproduct he had not been asked to create. But byproducts, it turns out, can change the world. Carrier patented his apparatus a few years later, and slowly the idea spread from one factory to the next, wherever moisture in the air was wrecking a product. Textile mills wanted it, so their threads would not snap. Candy makers wanted it, so their sweets would not slump. For a long stretch, air conditioning was an industrial tool, a quiet helper hidden inside the machinery of American manufacturing, and the ordinary person had no idea it existed. So how did it escape the factory and reach the public? It happened in the one place people were already desperate for relief and willing to pay to sit still in the dark: the movie theater. In the early days of cinema, summer was a disaster for theater owners. These were often windowless rooms packed with warm bodies, and by July they became suffocating boxes that no one wanted to enter. Audiences fanned themselves furiously with folding paper fans, a constant fluttering sea of them in the dark. And even that was not enough. Ticket sales collapsed in the hot months. Plenty of owners just gave up and shut their doors until the weather broke. Then, in 1922, Carrier brought his cooling into the theaters, and everything flipped. Suddenly, a movie house was not a place to endure. It was an escape, one of the only cool refuges in the whole sweltering city, and people flooded in just to feel that manufactured chill on their skin. The effect was so powerful that some theaters ran the cold air a little too enthusiastically. There are accounts of women draping newspapers over their legs to keep warm against the frigid updrafts, shivering happily through the summer while the streets outside baked. And here is where a small comfort became a giant cultural force. Because the theaters were now coolest exactly when the weather was hottest, summer stopped being the dead season for the movie business and became its most profitable one. The whole modern idea of the summer blockbuster, the big loud spectacle you line up for in July, grows directly out of that shift. It exists because air conditioning turned the hottest, deadest months into the season when everyone wanted to be inside a theater. A machine invented to protect ink had just reshaped the rhythm of American entertainment, And it was only getting started, because once people tasted that cool air, they did not want to give it back. And that is the moment the story stops being about factories and theaters and starts being about power. Return to that Capitol building, to the sweltering chamber that had earned its reputation as a death trap. For decades, the lawmakers had simply run away from the heat. But by the late 1920s, they finally did something their predecessors could only dream of. They cooled the building. Carrier equipment was installed in the Capitol in 1928, marketed with the almost magical phrase, manufactured weather. And over the following years, the cooling spread through the Senate, the House, and the office buildings around them. Think about what that quietly did. For the entire history of the Republic up to that point, the calendar of American government had been shackled to the seasons. The nation's business had to pause when the heat came, because the humans doing that business could not physically endure the room. Cool that room, and you cut the chain. Now Congress could work through July and August. Now the machinery of the federal government no longer had to stop just because the sun was high. The timing was almost eerie, because right around then, the country was moving the start of each congressional session into the depths of winter, which meant long sessions, stretching deep into summer, were about to become normal. Without cooling, that schedule would have been unbearable. With it, the modern, year-round, always working federal government became possible. If you are finding this as strange as it is true, this is a good moment to follow along, because keeping up with the channel means the next hidden history like this one will not slip quietly past you. And you will want to be here for the next part, because this is where a machine that started with wet paper does something no one could have predicted. It moves an entire nation. To see it, you have to look at where Americans actually lived. For most of the country's history, the population clustered in the north and the northeast. The great cities, the factories, the jobs, the money, all of it pooled in the cooler parts of the map. The south and the southwest had land, they had resources, they had people willing to work, but they carried a handicap that no amount of ambition could overcome. In the summer, they were brutal. The deep south was a furnace of heat and humidity. The southwest was worse in its own way, a desert where the temperature climbed past 100 degrees and stayed there, a place so punishing that vast stretches of it sat nearly empty well into the 20th century. Migration in America flowed one direction. It flowed toward the cool. So picture the map before the change. Phoenix, sitting in the Arizona desert, was a modest town in a place most people considered close to uninhabitable half the year. The idea that it would one day be one of the largest cities in the entire country would have sounded like a fever dream. Now watch what happens when the cool air comes home. Because after the Second World War, air conditioning finally made the leap from factories and theaters and government halls into ordinary houses. Through the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the window unit and then central cooling spread across American homes, and the effect on the map was staggering. By 1980, more than half of all new American homes were being built with central air conditioning already inside them. Today, roughly 90% of American households have some form of cooling. The luxury that once cost $1 a night at a southern hotel had become simply how Americans live. And with that, the ancient handicap of the South and the Southwest just vanished. Overnight, in the long view of history, the hottest regions of the country became places you could actually live year-round, work year-round, raise a family year-round. So the people came, and they did not trickle. They flooded. The region we now call the Sun Belt exploded. Houston, Atlanta, Miami, Phoenix, Dallas, cities that had been held back for centuries by their own climate, swelled into sprawling metropolises. Between 1950 and the year 2000, the state of Texas alone grew its population by 170%, the largest surge in the entire region. Across the Sun Belt as a whole, population climbed by more than 90% in just the 2 decades between 1970 and 1990, far outpacing the rest of the nation. That desert town of Phoenix, the one that had no business existing at scale, became one of the biggest cities in America, its subdivisions marching out across ground that would have been unthinkable to settle a lifetime earlier. None of it happened because the heat went away. The desert was every bit as hot as it had always been. It happened because, for the first time, the heat could be contained, shut out on the far side of a cooled wall. And the change went deeper than just where the crowds went. It reached into the shape of the houses themselves. For thousands of years, builders in hot places had fought the heat with design. They angled homes to catch the breeze. They built thick walls, high ceilings, deep porches, and shady courtyards. They clustered buildings for shade and planned whole towns around the movement of air. Air conditioning made all of that optional. Why orient a house toward the wind when a machine could simply manufacture the climate inside? So the new suburbs of the Sun Belt spread outward in sealed, boxy houses with the windows shut tight. Wide streets baking under thin tree cover, everyone retreating indoors to their own private, cooled bubble. The front porch, once the social heart of a southern evening, quietly faded, because the coolest, most pleasant place to be was no longer outside in the shared air. It was inside, alone, with the door closed. Even the politics of the country bent under the weight of all those moving people. Because in the United States, people are power in a very literal sense. Population decides how many seats a state gets in Congress and how many votes it carries in a presidential election. As tens of millions of Americans poured into the Sun Belt, they carried that political weight with them. Seats and electoral votes drained away from the old industrial North and gathered in the fast-growing South and West. A machine that began its life-saving ink in a Brooklyn print shop had, over the course of a single century, helped redraw not just the map of where Americans lived, but the map of who held power over them. Which brings us back to that soggy stack of paper and to the young engineer who never meant to do any of this. Willis Carrier set out to keep the colors on a magazine from smearing. He solved a humidity problem, and in solving it, he handed the country a tool that ended the deadly summers, rescued the movie theaters, unshackled the government from the seasons, and lifted an entire desert region out of near emptiness into the fastest-growing corner of the nation. Not one of those outcomes was on the drawing board, dated the 17th of July, 1902. They were all byproducts, ripples spreading out from a small, practical fix, growing until they reshaped a continent. But every story about conquering nature carries a quiet warning inside it, and this one saves its strangest turn for the very end. Because the Great Migration into the Sun Belt was built on a simple bargain. The heat was fierce, but the machine could always beat it. Now that bargain is starting to strain. As the planet warms, the hottest parts of the country are growing hotter still, pushing further past the comfortable and toward the genuinely dangerous, while some of the colder regions people once fled are becoming milder and more inviting. Researchers who study these patterns have begun to notice something that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. The current that ran south for half a century may be slowing, and in the years ahead, it could even begin to reverse. The very heat that air conditioning once tamed may be quietly rewriting the map all over again. And that is the real weight of the thing humming in your window. It was never just a way to stay cool. It was a hidden hand on the country, deciding for 100 years where Americans could live, how they built their homes, how they governed themselves, and which cities rose out of the dust. A machine born to save a magazine page ended up steering a nation. The only question left is where it steers it next. So here is one for the comments before you go. If you could pick anywhere in the country to ride out the next hot summer, where would it be, and would you trust the air conditioning to hold? drop it below, and until the next hidden history, keep looking a little closer at the ordinary things around you, because almost none of them are as simple as they seem.